Greetings and salutations, everyone, and welcome to another installment of, you guessed it, an Old Testament Academic Reacts. So in this episode, we are actually going to react to a video that was put out a couple of months ago, actually, by Creation Unfolding. Now, this is a conversation between the founder of Creation Unfolding and an upcoming archaeologist called Nate Loper, who's also affiliated with Associates for Biblical Research, on the date of the Exodus. Now, I will not be responding to the entire video, but rather to certain points of his argument throughout. He actually goes into the seal of Jacob at the end of the video, which I would like to address in the near future, and something else I can't remember off the top of my head. But anyway, mainly the video is about the early date Exodus. So if you guys actually like this sort of content, don't hesitate to hit the like button, and also make sure you guys have subscribed. So, if you guys do wish to support this channel financially, I'll also leave the link to my Patreon in the description, as well as the sources after this live feed. So I'll list my sources in the description below, so you can check them for yourself. So, without taking any more of your time, let's go ahead and dive into this interesting and fascinating discussion. As always, it always is when you come up with the Exodus. So.
And today I've got a new...
I should also like to add, I know my sound quality, again, isn't what it used to be, and that should change in the coming weeks. If this is too loud, or if you can't hear me very well, just let me know and I can hopefully change that up a little bit.
New guest on the channel. It's Nate Loper from Canyon Ministries in Arizona. So, Nate, welcome to Creation Unfolding. Let's get started with just you introducing yourself, any plugs, anything like that you want to say.
Yeah, Ken, it is fantastic to be here with you. It's just amazing to be able to connect with the creation community and share and do a lot of things. So yeah, I've got a few things that I can certainly share about what we do and some of the things that we have. In fact, let me pull up a PowerPoint because I can show the audience here a little bit about what we do with some great visuals and things like that. So
that'd be great. Let's do it.
This up there for you.
Yeah.
And today we're going to talk a little bit about biblical archaeology, but before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about kind of what we do as far as a ministry organization. And so I serve as the executive director for an organization known as Canyon Ministries.
Okay, I'm going to fast forward a little bit here because he kind of goes into this creation tours and adventures thing that he's got in Arizona. That's actually pretty cool, in my opinion. I really wouldn't mind that, but if you, I guess I'm just sort of giving him free real estate here. If you'd like to, there you go. I'm going to fast forward a little bit here because he just kind of sells his ministry called Canyon Ministries. They actually go in the Grand Canyon and everything. So we'll start about here, and then we'll
opinions out there.
Going.
But you know what, Ken? I like to stick with what the Bible has to say first and foremost, and that's my starting point. And so in Scripture, we actually are given a couple of different clues, you might say, a couple of things that help us understand the timeline of perhaps when the Exodus would have taken place.
Mm-hmm.
One of those interesting verses is Judges 11:26. And in Judges 11:26, it says this: Israel has been living here for 300 years, inhabiting Heshbon and the surrounding settlements. Now, this was during the time of the judges. This is actually Jephthah, one of the judges at that time. And we place this, historically right around the year 1100 to 1150 BC. And so at that time frame, Jephthah's basically saying Israel has been living in this land for 300 years. So again, if we're talking...
Yeah, about that. So there are a couple of problems with taking these dates. There's at least 300 years here, but we can just take here Judges 11 verse 26 off the cuff. The problem with the 300 years, of course, is that the judge who said that Israel had been in the land for 300 years was actually a really horrible judge. I'm sorry if you guys can hear the dog in the background. I hope not, but anyway. The problem is that Jephthah was a really horrible judge, and his 300 years is incorrect. The Book of Judges, I think I've said this enough, and you who go to Dr. Falk's channel have heard this 1,000 times probably, but the Book of Judges lists the judges didactically. What does that mean? It lists the judges from the best all the way down to the worst, in order of their uprightness or righteousness, beginning with Othniel and ending with, I think, Samson. So unfortunately, the writer of Judges here puts Jephthah ninth in that list, which, as longtime viewers of this channel and Dr. Falk's channel know, it's a horrible status for a judge. So, and the 300 years means emphasizes his untrustworthiness as a judge, as does his sacrifice of his own daughter. And the number that he'll mention this later. I'll let him get to it, but anyway, I'll let him get to it.
Talking right around 1100 perhaps BC. Well, 300 years before that places you right around the year 1400 BC. Mm-hmm. So that kind of gives us a rough timeline of, hey, they've been living here since around the year 1400 BC, which is interesting because that coincides with another fantastic verse, I think even a more direct understanding, and that is 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1, which says, in the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, the 2nd month, he began to build the temple of the Lord. So here we have a pretty good direct understanding of when the Israelites came out of Egypt. Mm-hmm. They came out of Egypt there, and it says that right around that same time that Solomon began to build the temple, which is right around the year 9.
All right. I wanted to pause there and let him sort of flesh out what he was trying to say, but the number that Nate mentions here in 1 Kings 6:1, again, if you're familiar with this, is part of a temple dedication that begins actually in 1 Kings 5 and runs all the way through 1 Kings 9. The whole thing is a temple dedication. The 480 years, the number there is merely symbolic in that they operate on a base 40, whereas if you go to Babylon or to Assyria, you'll note that it's a base it's a base 60. So for them, so 40 for the writers of the Old Testament was big, was really important here. Not only was it generational, it also basically it was generational. With the dating, with the dedication of the temple, with the 480 years, there's also a text critical issue in that if you compare the Septuagint along with the Masoretic text, the former number, that is in the Septuagint, the number is 440 years, while the MT or the Masoretic text says 480 years, which is a difference of about 40 years, and it's actually a really big thing. Since we can pinpoint dates within 5, give or take 5 years, plus 5 minus 5 years. So that's really problematic for the early daters. And we see this in other temple dedications as well with Dr. Richard Hess, who said that the literary presentation of the temple focuses on 1 Kings 5 through 9 and its description of the temple's construction and dedication. So he backs it up. Moreover, Victor Horowitz compares temple building accounts from ancient Mesopotamia, from Ugarit, and from the scriptures. He says 5 elements occur in all of these accounts. 1 is a reason to build or restore a temple that includes the divine blessing on the temple and a reason to build or restore a temple that includes a divine command or consent. 2, preparations for the construction. Thirdly, description of the construction process of the result. Fourthly, dedication of the structure. Fifthly, prayers for blessings on the temple and its builder. And sometimes, so 6 is like the vowel Y here, it's either a vowel or a consonant, conditional curses and blessings to the future ruler who will be called on to rebuild or restore the temple. And each of these categories is applied to the appropriate sections of 1 Kings chapters 5 through 9, and the structures of both are found to be identical. The description that mostly closely resembles 1 Kings 5 through 9 is that of the 12th and 11th century BC or BCE Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser I. Additional parallels with 1 Kings 5 through 9 may be found in other Mesopotamian and Ugaritic literature. And Assyrian texts also describe the return of the god to its temple and resembled the bringing of the ark to the temple in 1 Kings 8 verses 1 through 11. So Mesopotamian instructions for builders, receipts, didactic school texts, and the description of temple vessels and buildings all have parallels in 1 Kings 5 through 9. That is, they all go along with other temple dedications throughout the ancient Near East. And also, formally, Solomon's prayer of dedication in 1 Kings 8 may resemble other prayers of dedication as illustrated through Assyrian and other Assyrian and Babylonian rulers. In all of these, concerns for dynastic stability and the answering of prayers predominate. However, with the Mesopotamian rulers, it is assumed that the deity will answer because of the new home that is built for it. And so in 1 Kings, the temple is not assumed to be a home for the deity in the context of what is designated Deuteronomistic theology. Solomon appeals to the word of God in the forms of the divine promise to David and of a covenant made with all of Israel. Thus, an ancient Near Eastern form is followed, but its content is transformed by a wholly unique biblical theology. So, I just wanted to get all that
70
in there.
BC. We roll that clock back. So it began to rain in 970 BC, began to build the temple in 966 BC, and it says that it was 480 years after the Exodus when that.
Later on, he'll mention the book of Judges again as far as the dates are concerned in there, and it gets problematic, but we'll save that for the future, for the near future.
Temple began to be built. So you roll that clock back and you get an Exodus date of 1446 BC.
Simple math.
According to what we would see with, again, 1 Kings 6:1 and that supporting verse of Judges 11:26 and a few other things. Now, interestingly, if the Exodus took place in 1446 BC and then there was a 40-year wandering in the wilderness and then it took a few years to actually begin to, the conquest of Canaan, you might say, that places the Exodus right around 1446 BC and then would place them living there in the land, around the year 1400 or a little bit past that during the conquest of Canaan, which again, fascinatingly matches both of those verses, what we see there. So,
that's great.
In my opinion,
He also says fascinating about 8 million times. So,
Ken, that's when I like to place the Exodus date, right around the year 1446 BC.
Okay,
so
good. Because we know there's liberal dates, right, that put it a couple of hundred years later.
Yep, there are liberal dates that kind of put it years later, like 200 years later during the reign of Ramses II in the 19th dynasty of Egypt. That's kind of popularized in Hollywood oftentimes. And
you heard it here, folks. We're liberal if we go along with the late date Exodus. Oh, my word.
There's whole reasons for that, and there's reasons why we don't believe that necessarily, especially in conservative biblical archaeology. Right. But that's a whole talk for a whole nother time. Next time we come here.
Yes. No, we'll stick with 1400 BC ish.
So, and the reason I love to stick with that, not only because it's found in Scripture, but also we find evidence of that, I believe, in archaeology.
What does that mean?
In the archaeology
of Scripture? Egypt. What does that mean, found in Scripture? I mean, we're reading the same text.
And so the first thing we want to look at archaeologically is a fascinating inscription known as the Soleb inscription. And so the Soleb inscription was found at Soleb Temple, which is down in Nubia, kind of south of Egypt there, kind of on their southern border area. And this is an inscription that takes place during the reign of Amenhotep III. Okay, so Amenhotep III was a pretty powerful, pretty, wealthy ruler, you might say, at this time frame. And he also had a lot of like power throughout this time. And he reigned on the throne for a good number of years. This inscription is found at a temple that was built in a dedication for what's known as his Heb-Sed festival. And so the Heb-Sed festival was an event that if a pharaoh had been ruling, a king was ruling for 30 years, they would have a big celebration in honor of him. And so it was a big celebration to celebrate his 30-year reign. And it was also an opportunity for this king to...
Yep. So the Heb-Sed festival is an Egyptian festival, and it was reserved for kings of Egypt who were supposed to demonstrate their virility and their strength as king. And if they couldn't do it, then they weren't really. If they couldn't do it anymore, if they couldn't pass the test, if you will, they would be considered not. I don't want to say not a good king because they could have been a good king before, but it was showing weakness or decline if they couldn't pass the Heb-Sed festival.
To show the kingdom that he was still worthy of the throne, and he still had the power and virility to hold this power. So he actually had to perform a number of feats of strength, like racing around a big circuit and shooting arrows and performing in front of a whole crowd of people to make sure that he was still fit to rule.
Absolutely.
And so this Heb-Sed festival took place in about 30-year reign of Amenhotep II, who would place conservatively right around the year 1407 to 1370 BC, using what we call the kind of high Egyptian chronology dates that we like to look at.
Which we've demonstrated here on this channel, and as well as Dr. Falk's channel in the past, that is extremely problematic. So.
And there's a temple there with inscriptions on there, and there are multiple pillars, you see. And on these pillars, there are a number of people who are basically portrayed with their hands bound behind them, and name rings that you see. So you can see here, kind of, there's actually, let me pull up this little laser pointer so I can show you guys. So here you can see a person with his hands bound behind him.
Yep.
And you can see a name ring in the middle here, similar to a cartouche, but this is not a royal cartouche. This is actually a name ring. And on there, we can see that there's a name of the people group. Now, there are dozens of these people with their hands bound behind them, and it basically doesn't necessarily mean that they were slaves of this pharaoh, but it means that he had the power, the might, and in his opinion, the dominion of all these people. And Ken, you might say it's a nice early form of propaganda, right?
Okay, interesting.
So what they're trying to...
Interesting thing about Egyptian propaganda is Ramesses II was great at it. As far as the Battle of Kadesh is concerned, you had the battle report, and then you had the poem itself. So Ramesses II was extremely good at the propaganda too, because the Battle of Kadesh was actually a draw and not an actual Egyptian victory. So
do was to show that this king, in all his grand might and power, has the authority and the power and subjugates everyone else in the surrounding land. So you can see these name rings and the same sort of portrayal in multiple different temples and inscriptions throughout Egypt. And here is a fascinating one that's found at the Soleb Temple in Nubia. And it's fascinating because, Ken, this is the earliest known use of the name Yahweh.
Wow. That's amazing.
Powerful, right?
He'll continue on here, but I should like to mention that the Soleb inscription is certainly contested by several scholars, Egyptologists, as well as biblical scholars. So we're not even certain if Yahweh is in fact Yahweh there, and I think that we should at least wait for more evidence that would support that claim. But for now, the uncontested is the Mesha stele. The uncontested name for Yahweh is on the Mesha stele, which dates a few centuries later. But for the most part, for the Soleb inscription, we don't know if it's the name of a territory, a deity, or a deity, for example. But I will say that the debate surrounding the name on the Soleb inscription should begin here. Otherwise, the first mention of Yahweh, as I said, is on the Mesha inscription, which dates to the 9th century, so a few centuries later. Also, no one uses, I mentioned this briefly in passing a few seconds ago, but no one uses the high chronology today among scholarship. Scholars today opt for something called a low chronology, which would put the reign of Amenhotep II at 1423 to 1399, rather than the dates he gives. I just think that it's an interesting and it's problematic that he would build his case on the surety of a contested inscription without acknowledging debates surrounding said inscription. Furthermore, he seems to equivocate. Oh wait, we'll get there later because I'm jumping ahead of my notes. So, so he did talk about Shazu a little bit. So furthermore, he seems also to equivocate the Shazu with Israel, which isn't even mentioned until the victory stele, that is Israel, erected by Merneptah around 1208, 1210. But we'll talk about the victory stele or the Merneptah stele later.
Of course, Yahweh is kind of how we would today would say the name for the biblical name of God that we find in the Bible.
Right.
And so what we see in this name ring, and I'll highlight it for you here, in this name ring, we actually see an inscription that says the Shasu of Yahweh. And so beginning up here, we have the name of the people group right here. And so this is kind of a pool with some lotus plants growing out of it. That says the sound for Shah, and then a S right here, and then a little quail chick for the like a U or an U sound.
Yeah.
So together, that would say Shasu.
Mm-hmm.
And then down below with these two reeds kind of says Yah, and then kind of a house symbol says H, Yahoo, again, another quill check, Yahoo, and then this makes kind of an O or an OH sound. So together this says Yahuwah. So Shasu of Yahuwah.
Volt asks, wasn't there a similar deity in Egypt in pronunciation, at least with Yahweh? I do think so as well. I'm not really familiar with that yet. I've just begun studying that, so I'll have to get back to answer that question, but I do believe so off the top of my head.
And so Yahuwah is how they would typically say Yahweh, how we say it today. Yeah. Yod, He, Vah, He, we kind of have in the Hebrew letters Yahuwah.
Yep.
Now, we understand the name Yahweh or Yahuwah from here, which is how they would say the biblical name of the biblical God. So what we're seeing here is God's name, Yahweh, but then we have this other name of a people group. It says Shasu. Now, who were the Shasu? That's a question people ask. Now, interestingly, the Shasu were not a specific people, okay? The word Shasu does not denote a nationality or a specific nation or people group. The word Shasu basically means a Bedouin or a wanderer, a traveler, right? And so it's somebody that is without a city, without a kingdom, without a state, you might say, but is a nomadic group of wanderers that travel in the desert.
Mm-hmm.
Now think about that for a minute.
Yeah.
Fascinatingly, again, Amenhotep II reigns from 1407 to 1370, right around that time frame.
And again, those
this
dates
is
are
right
slightly
around
off,
the time frame of the wandering in the wilderness.
Okay, so but if this is in Egypt, so this was made or created after they were taken from Egypt. Then,
yep, this would have been created after the Exodus, after they left. And when they were still kind of wandering around for the 40 years.
So my suspicions are kind of confirmed here. He actually equivocates the Shazu with the Israelites.
In the wilderness before they went into the promised land.
Okay, and so what would be the purpose of that? Why would he create these hieroglyphs, talking about this people that have left Egypt?
That's a great question. So they're a wandering band of nomadic desert dwellers at this point. They're not living in a city-state or a home or a nation yet. They are a people without a home, but they're known, because they're living for 40 years in the desert, traveling from place to place to place. So fascinatingly, the depiction of them that we see here as the Shasu or the wanderers of Yahweh matches exactly the condition of what was happening with the Hebrew people at this time. They were nomadic wanderers in the desert. And so they know them because they're a known people group, although they're not denoted like some of the other cities and other nations and people groups. So you would see other groups on there, depending on where they were from. There are other name rings on here for people that lived in promised land at that point. Right. So we have Canaan on there, we have Ashkelon, we have other cities, and those were known city-states and people groups, and they're also listed on there. But then we have, again, this interesting one of the Shasu, in other words, the wanderers of Yahweh. Of course, this takes place before there was the nation or kingdom of Israel, before they were established in the promised land, before they had the home, they were wanderers.
Right.
So it's fascinating.
Again here. I think it's worth noting once more that the Soleb inscription. Yeah, absolutely. So the vault says there's no direct link of Israel to Shazu, and that is 100% correct. He seems either to be jumping the gun or equivocating the Shazu with the Israelites, which is extremely problematic since the Soleb inscription is contested. So there's a lot of debate. No, I don't really think any other scholars think that the name there Yahweh is Yahweh, but or even the Shazu or the Israelites. It just seems like he's got a case of pareidolia. That is, he just wants to see what he wants to see. And interestingly, in Dr. James Hoffmeier's book entitled Israel and Egypt, we do have hieroglyphs. He will go into this a little bit, so maybe I should hold off on this next section. No, I'm sorry. No. Well, yeah. I'll mention this and then we'll go through it again later because he brings up the hieroglyphs again. But in Dr. Hoffmeier's book entitled Israel and Egypt, we actually do have hieroglyphs that mention Israel. However, the determinative at the end of the word denotes foreign people. More on this later. Hoffmeier also notes that on the Merneptah stele, there are a total of 8 toponyms or toponyms that use the determinative associated with territory, but the determinative that precedes Israel or precedes Israel applies to foreign people. What I mean by that is there's another determinative that looks like a mountain symbol, and it usually denotes landed ethnic group, a landed ethnic group. So, but none of the other toponyms have the foreign people determinative with the stick and then the people determinative, suggesting that there was something different with the Israelites. So we should understand, therefore, that Israel were not a settled or landed people group, but wandering still. Additionally, it's interesting here. I don't know if they're going to get into this or if it's even crossed their minds yet. But additionally, this Merneptah stele dates to roughly 1210 BC, putting the wandering in the 13th century, it would seem, rather than the 14th century, as here Nate Loper suggests.
That we see this depiction, the earliest known use of the name Yahweh, coinciding exactly with how you should describe them at this time frame.
Yeah, that's really cool because that's exactly what they were. They were wandering around, kind of lost for 40 years.
Exactly.
So that would be a good depiction of them.
I think it's pretty fascinating. I mean, again, not only is it fascinating because it's Yahweh, the earliest known written name, but again, it corresponds with the exact right style of what you should write them in, wandering nomadic tribal group.
Right.
So I think it's fascinating. And another set of artifacts that kind of tie in with the same time frame, and then shortly after this are what we call the Amarna letters or the Amarna tablets. Now, this is a collection of about 382 cuneiform tablets. Many of them were excavated by Flinders Petrie, kind of the father of modern-day Egyptology, Christian who discovered many great monuments and things that we still look at in biblical archaeology today. And they were discovered in the capital city of Amarna, or what was known in those days as the kingdom of Akhenaten and Akhenaten, which is kind of basically a pharaoh that came on right after.
Okay, it's still the New Kingdom, but it's the heretical reign of Akhenaten, and it was in the city of Akhenaten, which is the horizon of the Aten, is what the name of the city means. And this was still the 18th dynasty. Akhenaten was Amenhotep IV, so he's Amenhotep III's successor in this, and right around here is where we start seeing the Amarna letters appear. As you can see, there's written in, it says written from Canaan. Okay, it was written in Akkadian, but it's different than the Akkadian from Babylon. You can tell it wasn't their actual native language. We can actually read it, and we know that it wasn't a native speaker. It was because Akkadian was the lingua franca at the time. So the scribes writing Akkadian, it was probably a second language to them rather than a native language. That's what I'm trying to say.
We see Amenhotep III. His son Akhenaten rose to the throne. He was known as the heretic king because he did away with the Egyptian pantheon of gods and decided to worship kind of one god that he called the Aten, which was represented as the sun disk or solar.
And it's a solar disk. It's misunderstood about what's going on here. He seems to close temples that rivaled the Aten. So, and the odd 10 is sort of associated with sun disk. So, any gods or goddesses that were associated with the sun disk were closed down. It wasn't the entire Egyptian pantheon. So, hey Shiru, what's going on, bro?
Disk in the sky. He moved the entire capital city to a city that he built, Akhenaten, which he built and kind of named after all this thing. And there we have found about 382, like I said, letters that are written in cuneiform.
Mm-hmm.
Now, cuneiform was the kind of lingua franca of the day. This was the traditional writing style that they used between different nations in those times. And so it's not necessarily in Egyptian hieroglyphics, but it's in the Akkadian style language and the cuneiform writing style.
Mm-hmm.
Now, fascinating thing, these stone or these clay tablets that were baked, they have many letters, a lot of different content, and some were, just general things that are taking place. But there's a number of them that we found that actually are very fascinating because about 30 of them mention a people group known as the Habiru. Now, many linguists look at the word Habiru and they say, that is the same linguistic uses that we would say for the word Hebrew, right?
No.
So Habiru or Hapiru, the same we see for the word Hebrew.
What year are we? I mean, what are we talking as far as?
Shiru, sorry, bro. I thought you were just introducing yourself. We're going over a video on the Exodus put out by Creation Unfolding for you guys. Okay, so I was going to stop it here too. So the Habiru, of course, like you said, were not a people group, but were rather a social class of miscreants who lived on the fringes of society. The Habiru were groups of people who looted and generally caused chaos and disarray. And we see them mentioned here in the Armana letters through the pleas of the Canaanite kings who are asking Egypt for assistance. Furthermore, Maxwell Miller and John Hayes, from their book, A History of Ancient Israel and Judah, they say that the Armana letters picture the Habiru as living in Palestine and challenging not only the Canaanite authorities there, but also the Egyptian authority, the Egyptian presence there. And moreover, Baruch Halpern, in his book, The Emergence of Israel and Canaan, argues that the Habiru were a very unstable group who neither work together nor live together and have no geographic concentration, while some are integrated into the state system. The situation leads to the conclusion that no one would call themselves Habiru because society labeled anyone deemed to be outside the law. That's essentially what they were. They were outside of the law. As Habiru, according to Kurt Knoll in his book, Canaan and Israel in Antiquity. Thus, the Habiru become a term of slander and could be used for outcasts, refugees, fugitives, rebels, and slaves. And it's interesting here because he'll try and make this connection that since the Hebrews were slaves in Egypt, that they must be Habiru because slaves is also included among one of the definitions of the Habiru.
We're talking about some of these letters start off with the end of the reign of Amenhotep III, the guy we just talked about, and then going into his son Akhenaten, who was Amenhotep IV, became Akhenaten. And so this
the Armana letters actually don't stop there. They actually run all the way to the reign of Tut, I think, King Tutankhamun.
Time frame places us from probably right around the year, I would say around late 1390s, going into that time frame. So we're looking at the time frame of the conquest of Canaan and shortly after that.
Right. Yep. Cool.
So fascinating. These letters are written.
I think I've made this mention before, but it's extremely problematic. I think I've made this mention on Inspiring Philosophy's channel before. At least one of his subscribers came across and had this question for him. It's really problematic for the early daters since Egypt had such a strong presence in the Levant, with their garrison outposts extracting tribute and exploiting the resources. They didn't really have an empire per se. It was merely an Egyptian. It was a presence there to exact tribute from them and to the resources. But I think it's really problematic for early daters since if they're leaving in 1400 and then wandering around the wilderness for 40 years and then coming up on the backside, Egypt's still there and we're in the 18th dynasty still. So they're still there is the problem. You could say they're in the foothills. There wasn't such an Egyptian presence. I kind of beg to differ, especially if they're going deep into the Levant is problematic. But that's a side issue. What I want to Nate kind of confirms what I've been saying is that he equates the Hebrews with the Habiru of the Armana letters, which were written as a logogram. They were written to sagas. Sorry, I'm a nerdy Akkadian dude. In Akkadian, that's where they were called. That was the logogram for them. So it was just one sign that called them that, sagas. And in Ugaritic, it was some form of Habiru. The H may have been aspirated, we're not sure, which was a type of foreign labor in Ugarit. Interestingly, the early date Exodus proponents will argue that the Habiru must be the Hebrews, though, because some letters read as follows, and I'll quote one of them. Oh shoot, I didn't actually put which one, but I want to say it's it might be the one on the screen there, EA286. So this one will read, Habiru have plundered all the lands of the king. The Habiru have taken the very cities of the king. If Pharaoh does not send archers, the land of the king will desert to the Habiru. So you see, this must be the Hebrews during the conquest, right? So it is clear, however, from these references, though, that Habiru is not an ethnic designation, but rather a social element. And he seems to equate that. He seems to say this is both a social class and an ethnic group, which it can't be both. They can't be both, because you're either an ethnic group or a social class of miscreants from various other ethnic groups, so who live on the fringes of society, as I said. So from the Biblical Archaeological Review now, Anson Rainey avers that it is likewise clear from the personal names of individual Habiru that they are not from a single linguistic group either. And moreover, there seems to have been several kinds of Habiru, but always of inferior status, and the term itself has a negative connotation. So again, the Habiru were always viewed as negatively. So, and the word is sometimes used as a synonym for a mutineer or pauper. Additionally, sometimes Habiru are individuals and sometimes members of a group, so they kind of go in and out. Some are servants and slaves, which Mr. Loper here seems to think. Others are members of robber bands who attack and plunder, and especially in times of disintegrating rule. Elsewhere, they seem to have become a ruler's militia. Yes, they were actually hired as militia. In other instances, individual Habiru are recruited as mercenaries into a militia, sometimes as a benefice, I can never say that word. They were given lands and estates, but they are never mentioned as pastoralists, which is interesting, as are the Hebrews, and they are never referred to as belonging to tribes. Rainey continues stating elsewhere in a discussion too technical for the BAR, that is the Biblical Archaeological Review, there is absolutely no linguistic relationship between Habiru and Hebrew. I think I might be delving into something a little more. He'll get into this in a little bit, but we'll address it here in a little bit. Tim Miara says, when I used to be an early Exodus stater, the first time I felt uneasy about my position was when I started reading their Amana letters. Felt like the supposed conquest was pretty much lacking in them. And it is, absolutely. There really isn't any evidence that would lead one to the conclusion that it was a conquest going on there. It was the Canaanite rulers pleading for help from miscreants, rebels. They could have been murderers. They could have been grapists. They could have been anything. They were just causing havoc, chaos, disrupting the economy, disrupting the societal flow, the ebb and flow of society, and etc. The one thing that got me, though, was if they're leaving Egypt in 1400 and they're fleeing the Egyptians and they come around the backside of the desert, the Egyptians are there too. So it was like leaving Egypt to go to Egypt, which made no sense to me. So for me, that was what started it off for me with the early date Exodus.
From Canaanite and Amorite leaders, and they're pleading for help from these conquering Habiru who are coming into the land now. And it's fascinating. So we have different numbers for these. They're called EA, which means El Amarna, where they were discovered. So EA 286, for example, says, all the lands of the king are being plundered by the Habiru. And so at this time, Egypt actually had kind of dominion over the whole land, the whole region of Canaan, throughout the Levant, they had
and he actually admits it, but doesn't seem to. He kind of glosses over that, right? Like he doesn't make that connection. Oh, Egypt's up there, but doesn't make that connection. It just drives me nuts.
dominion over it. And so even though they had local rulers and city states, everybody kind of had to pay homage to the king of Egypt. And so he basically defeated them and put them under his thumb and said, hey, as long as you pay taxes and don't fight against us, give us tribute, you can continue to live basically as vassal states. And so when there's a new enemy that comes into town, all these guys over there are saying, hey, Pharaoh, we're kind of underneath your rule and also under your protection. Come help us, because all of our lands are being plundered by the Habiru.
Right, interesting.
So that's EA 286.
Yeah,
EA
he'll go into another
287
letter
says
too, yeah.
the Habiru are now attempting to take Jerusalem.
Fascinating. That's amazing. Yeah.
That doesn't.
EA 290.
And that doesn't even mean anything. So you have the Habiru taking Jerusalem. Okay, what? So?
Says, but now even a town near Jerusalem, Bethlami by name. So Bethlami is the name Bethlehem. It's an older town. So Bethlami, a village which once belonged to the king, has fallen to the enemy. If no archers are sent, the lands of the king will be taken by the Habiru people.
The letters kind of repeat some of the same things. They send archers, or there's even a formulaic beginning to the letters as well. I should have put that in there, but it's pretty standard formula for the Armana letters. You find them in Ugaritic letters as well, when they're addressing the Hittites or pleading for the Hittites for help during the Sea People, when the Sea Peoples are invading. I'm talking about the Ugaritic letters, not the Armana letters, by the way. But it's the same formula. They kind of repeat the same thing.
Yeah, and it's fascinating. And then here's a really interesting thing. EA 288 says, but now the Habiru have captured the cities of the king, and it goes on to mention that these were slaves who had become these Habiru.
So it talks about this people group who are taking over, says that they were slaves?
Absolutely.
Oh, that's pretty interesting.
Now, this takes place.
That's another thing. Slavery was a thing in the ancient Near East. Again,
the right people, the right time,
equal
and the right circumstances.
causation.
All these things come together. So this is the same timeline that we see with the conquest of Canaan, and as they're continuing into the land to establish, where the different tribes are going to live, and they're continuing to establish themselves. Right. These rulers, they're living there in that land of Canaan, are writing for help, and they're saying that the Habiru, the Hebrew, are coming through, and they're taking, place after place after place, and they even mention that these people used to be slaves, and now they've rose.
Right.
Fascinating corresponding evidence, I think.
So just looking at it critically, what do the liberal scholars have to say about that?
What do we say?
I'm sure that they don't agree.
So some liberal scholars would say, oh, well, this takes place, but this is way earlier than when we place the Exodus date. So if there was an Exodus, if there was an establishment of the Israelites in Canaan, this predates them by hundreds of years.
Right.
And again, that goes...
Which is correct. It predates it by at least 200 years. So at least he's got that right.
Into a whole different topic of biblical chronology and when we actually should date things. Yeah. Again, that's like a totally different topic we'll talk about another time, I believe. Right. But what we're looking at here, they're looking at saying, well, maybe it was a different people group, and yeah, it's strange how the word Hebrew and Habiru are almost identical, but no, it can't be the same people. So they're not providing any good evidence against it. They're just simply saying we don't believe in these timelines, so we're going to outright reject it. Right. And so really that comes from a place of presupposition rather than physical evidence and archaeology.
No, it doesn't come from presuppositionalism. Linguistically, the Habiru and Hebrew Ivri are not related. They're not related. If you look at the three letters, usually in Semitics you get the three root consonants, and they don't even match up. So there's a P and a B, there's a pay and a bait mixed up in there for one, but they linguistically are not related.
Yeah, I think it comes from it comes from a place of bias.
It does.
I mean, if it's talking about these people.
So he goes on a little tirade here about biases and everything, and they're completely unaware that they're also operating under a bias, which is what everyone does in any argument since the beginning of arguments. So I think that's rather unfair that they do that. But anyway, let me see. I forget how long they actually go for this.
There was a Semitic Hebrew people group living in Egypt, and
Okay.
fascinating things. And so, yeah, in my opinion, this is one of those things that I like to point to and say, look at what the evidence actually shows us.
Yeah,
I think it's exciting.
Yeah, that's excellent.
Yeah. So as we continue, right around the same time frame, we have another fascinating piece of Egyptian archaeology. Now, Ken, this is not necessarily found in Egypt. This is actually found over in Israel and today in modern Palestine, actually. And this is what we call the Mount Ebal altar. And so this is found, you can see on the map.
I'm actually going to skip over this because this was discussed at length, ad nauseum over the past year. As far as the mount, not so much the altar, but the tablet that was found last year. At the beginning, was at the beginning of 2023 or 2024. And Dr. Stripling published it in a non-archaeological review or magazine or journal, and he received so much, not hate, but pushback on it. So, Tim Miara says, if you try to write Hebrews in Habiru Hebrew script, they will look nothing alike. Correct. They look nothing alike. They are not related. And actually, I was going to segue into this. Some scholars will try to relate it, and then some usually it's the ABR crowd that will try to say the Habiru and the Ivri are related. The Habiru and the Hebrew are related. But other scholars, I can't give a name here, I'm sorry, I tried to find names specifically, but they'll say, is nothing short of silly and absurd mental gymnastics by wishful thinkers who tend to ignore the reality of linguistics. Another term may indeed have something to do with the early Israelites, but it's not here. So, there. Anyway, he kind of goes off into this tirade about Mount Ebal and the altar there, and I've got no problem with his conclusion on the altar because he tends to go with I think Adam Zini, I'm forgetting the brain farting, this guy, the archaeologist who dug there in the 80s and found the altar. I think he was a student of Yigdale, and I can't remember his name. Oh well. Adam Zertal, right? I think. Oh yeah, it was Adam Zertal, I think. Yeah, they got it. Yeah. What your pastor didn't tell you says Stripling and crew certainly got hate for their article. Absolutely, they did. Not only from the YouTube community, but also scholars like Christopher Rolston over at George Washington University. He definitely demonstrated some hate and pushback on it. Others mocked the tablet and said, there's no way, look, it just looks like scribblings. One article, I think Rolston was the one who suggested it was a fishing net, or it came from a fishing net. So it was pretty crazy on that. But I'm going to fast forward here. There's so here's the altar that we're talking about here. It's obviously smaller for internet purposes. That was a joke. But here's the altar that was discovered there, and it dates to actually interesting. This altar dates to the early Iron Age rather than the late Bronze Age. So, which again is problematic for early date Exodus proponents. Because again, the conquest, it would have to be an early Bronze Age altar, and it just simply isn't. The altar dates to the early Iron Age at the earliest. Let me see here. Fast forwarding, sir. Oh yeah, then he goes into these scarabs here. I'll let him talk a little bit about him.
Sure, kind of a diagram of what the
So he's
altar used to
finishing up
look
the
like.
description of the altar.
In the middle
and
here
he'll
is
go
kind of the
into
main
these
section. There's
scarabs
a
here.
ramp leading up here. This ramp goes up in the middle, and then you kind of see a rectangular structure.
Yep.
This is the main altar platform.
In that last photo, I could see that ramp on the right hand side.
Exactly.
That
The
there,
ramp
yeah, right
here.
there, yeah. What's that scale on there?
Boy, I'm trying to remember what.
Tim, Maria says that was the most absurd reading of an empty tablet ever. Yeah, it was crazy. And Stripling tried to make this was a cursed tablet and everything. And if you look at it, and anyone who has first year Hebrew students, you could say first semester Hebrew students could say, what is this? It doesn't even look like Paleo Hebrew. It doesn't even look like the square script. What is it? So
the scale is, we're talking about at least, I think, 30 to 50 feet across there.
Wow. Okay.
Like
So
that's
so if you were standing there, would your body would go halfway up that wall there?
Yeah, I would imagine so.
Okay.
Yeah, somewhere I've got the dimensions written down there. I should probably remember that. But we're seeing, a pretty good sized altar. And in the very middle, if you see, there's actually a circular structure right there in the middle.
I thought it was earlier.
That's the original kind of the altar fire pit. And then on top here, you have kind of the altar platform surrounding it. That's what Joshua 8:30 goes on, and again, tells shuffling steps. So you're not taking these kind of a stone amulet, almost like a signet or a seal. They're typically fairly small. I've got a number of scarabs in my collection. I've seen hundreds of them that I studied over the years.
Which I found this kind of strange, that he says he has a collection of scarabs. I didn't know if you could actually have a collection of scarabs like that. I didn't know if you could have a collection of any archaeological artifacts. I thought that they all had to be submitted to either a museum. They couldn't leave the country. So I'm wondering how on earth, well, he got them in Israel, so it's a bit different. Egyptian rules with archaeology are different. I don't think anything in Egypt can leave Egypt now, any archaeological findings. Israel, I know, operates kind of differently. So with these scarabs, since they were found in Israel, it'd be interesting how he got those scarabs. What your pastor didn't tell you says, I like Nate, but framing things as liberal scholars versus early date while ignoring the tons of very conservative scholars like David Falk is not a good look. And it really isn't. It's not a good look for him. And if you know he's associated with Associates for Biblical Research, it makes it even that much worse. So I don't think he's painting the opposition in a positive light, which is what you should do. You should be like, okay, this is what we believe, this is why we believe it, and then present your evidence, and then you say this is what the opposition believes, however we disagree because of this. That's usually how these things go, and it doesn't really do it. It just hurls sort of, it's not liberal scholars like, oh, whoa, we're so far leaning left that it's crazy. I think Kramer did that in his last video on, oh gosh, what was it? I'm brain farting massively now, but Kramer on Bible Expedition put out a video on that's what it was, on the city of and he had this narrative, though they must be liberal scholars over at Southern Baptist University in Louisville, Kentucky. It was crazy. So,
and they're typically, I would say, anywhere from about a half an inch all the way up to an inch or two in size. And oftentimes they have a hole that goes through the middle of it, and so you can wear it either as a necklace or as a ring. So oftentimes we see the name of a king or a ruler on them because they were used as royal signet stamps and rings. They were also used as good luck charms. And so if you had a powerful ruler, you might want to carry his name with you as a talisman. And this is what we see with this Thutmose III scarab. So Thutmose III is a pharaoh that many of us believe was the pharaoh that Moses fled from when he went into Midian. The pharaoh that's on the throne for the 40 years while he's in Midian and then dies.
How does he know it was Thutmose III? How do you know? Just because there's a signet ring there doesn't mean anything.
Shortly before Moses' return. So this is right before the timeline of the Exodus. And so over there in the altar, we found a scarab that has his name. Now, again, this is turned to the side, but this is the cartouche. And this says right here, it says Men Keper Ra. And so Men Keper Ra was the royal throne name of Thutmose III. And so interesting, it's found in the foundation deposits of this altar. And then another scarab is found, and the stylistic design here has kind of lower crowns of Lower Egypt, the red crown, the deshret we call it, and the kind of stylistic flower
That's
lotus design.
head jet.
And so looking at this stylistically, many of us would say this dates.
So the deshret was the red crown, and the head jet was the white one.
To around the second intermediate to early New Kingdom period. So to help understand that, the New Kingdom is when we would place the Exodus during 1446 BC.
New Kingdom,
So
yes.
again, we're looking at a
1446,
scarab here
no.
that dates right before the Exodus, and a scarab that
Actually,
also
yeah.
dates to the same
Sorry.
time frame or right before the Exodus. Both of these, we believe, are contemporaries of each other, and both of these were found in the foundation, in other words, the lowest deposits of this altar.
I wouldn't say these scarabs are contemporaries. The second one, it says second intermediate period, was slightly before Tutmosis III by about maybe 100 years. So I really wouldn't. I wouldn't put them as contemporaries.
Altar.
So you've got a pretty firm date in a temple on Mount Ebal in Israel, and then that correlates very nicely with that scripture from Joshua.
Exactly, right? We're seeing the conquest of Canaan. We're seeing the right time frame. Now, why are they in the altar deposits? Well, an altar is a place of sacrifice, right? You're giving up things, and so
that's interesting that they're making that connection, that because the scarabs are found near the altar, well, it's got to be, it should date the altar to the early Bronze Age, and that's not how that works. So
we don't know exactly what it was, but we read in scripture that Mount Ebal was a mount of curses. So perhaps somebody, in an attempt to also add to the curse, a curse upon Pharaoh in Egypt who enslaved us, maybe they're also adding that to the fire, so to speak. In other words,
as Dr. Falk would say, it's nothing but empty conjecture, right? It seems like an argument from absence. This whole thing.
Words like an effigy to burn up the name of the Pharaoh. Perhaps that's why it's found there, but maybe also because this was a rededication, somebody had this with them from the Exodus all the way through, passed it on to their children into the promised land now, and their children now had this. And again, these were oftentimes seen as talismans, as good luck charms.
Right.
Somebody going into this time frame had a talisman, you might say, of Tutmosis III.
Guys, I'm going to fast forward because he's.
Now, if we think about the context of what
lights, of course,
we're finding what Scripture says. We're finding it in science. We're finding it in. Fast forward a little, about 200 years almost. Another fascinating piece of archaeology, though again was also discovered by Flinders Petrie, and this is in the Cairo Egyptian Museum. And on here, what we have is the oldest undisputed reference to Israel. Now, that's pretty neat. By name.
Correct.
Now, time frame for this is right around the year 1208 BC. And we call this the Merneptah stela, or the Merimta stela. Now, Merneptah, or should be...
Okay, I'm going to be pedantic here. I don't like the Merimta pronunciation. Merneptah sounds...
Technically pronounced Merimta, but everyone says Merneptah. He was the son of Ramses II.
Correct.
Kind of Ramses the Great, we oftentimes talk about. And this is a stela or stela that was found. And on here, it records multiple great things that he had done. And so it records his conquest of different nations and kingdoms and some of his campaigns that he did. So there are a number of people groups listed on here, groups that we kind of are familiar with, like Ashkelon and Canaan. And then there's another people group on here mentioned by name, and it calls them the people of Israel. And this is the oldest undisputed reference to Israel. Now, when you're looking at a stela like this, you probably think it's not that big. When I thought, I saw pictures of it, when I learned about it, I thought it was maybe 2 to 3 feet tall. I've seen a lot of other stela that are fairly small, so I'm thinking maybe
that's what I'm thinking, a couple of feet.
Yeah, well, no, it's actually much bigger than that.
Wow, look at that.
Well, there's a picture that I took with me standing next to it in the Egyptian Museum there in Cairo. Wow. It's actually quite a bit bigger. And behind the glass section is actually where we find the Israel name. It's down here near the bottom. If you look closer, you can actually see so many people have touched it. It's actually kind of rubbed a section in there, kind of oil from your fingers. So they've actually protected it with glass to keep people from either damaging it or touching it or trying to chisel it out, something like that.
That's
because
interesting.
Again, this is the oldest undisputed reference to Israel.
Yeah.
Correct.
So those signs we see are found over here from the right. They actually read right to left in the Egyptian hieroglyphics. And in the beginning here, we have two reeds for the kind of sound for y or I.
Yeah.
There's a kind of a bolt symbol here for is,
So
for
it's gonna go
S.
through the
There's a mouth symbol we see here, which is pretty
hieroglyph.
neat. Kind of a oval shaped mouth symbol. And that typically makes the sound R, but
R.
also sometimes makes the sound for L. The Egyptians didn't really have differentiating sounds at this time for R and L. And in fact, a lot of people groups still confuse R's and L's.
Actually, I think the R or the L there maybe was another glyph that helped Champollion decipher the glyphs on another stele for Ptolemy the Fifth. I think it was the same sign. It may have been a different glyph though, to help Cleopatra and Ramesses. And then that's how they used it to decipher the hieroglyphs about 200 years ago. So, geez, it's been 200 years. Jeez.
Also, they kind of mix them together. They're kind of interchangeable.
Mm-hmm.
So this same symbol can say R. It can also mean an L sound, especially near the end of a word. But we see here basically Israel, and it ends right here with another mouth symbol. And in this case, it's more that L sound at the end. Here we see Israel. And then over here we have a curved throw stick. This is denoting them as an Asiatic people group, a foreign people group. Asiatic, not necessarily like from the Far East, but basically people who live to the east. Mm-hmm. And that's how the Egyptians would refer to people, the people of Israel, the Hebrew people. They were an Asiatic people to the east. So we see that, and then over here we see a seated man and a woman with three lines underneath, referring to them as a people group or a collection of people.
Yeah.
So putting it together right to left, we see Israel, a people group or a foreign people
group. Yeah.
And on here again, it talks about different people groups they defeated and how they, defeated them this way and that way. But the stela regarding Israel says, Israel is laid waste, its seed is no more. Now, some have said, well, wait a minute, the Israelites were never wiped out as a people group entirely. They're kind of thinking of like the seed of Abraham or the seed of, they're kind of saying, oh, they never wiped out the people group, so this must...
Or it could be war rhetoric. So what I find interesting here is that Nate will not address that the determinatives at the end, the determinatives at the end of this word indicates that the Israelites were still wandering. He kind of wants to push this narrative that they were there and that the conquest was taking place at this time. The determinative for landed people would have been, as I said earlier, that mountain determinative. It's got a foundation and then it's got three humps. So that's the determinative we're looking for. I don't have a picture for you guys, but the determinative, that's the one for a country or a nation, in other words. So, and again, I'm going to reference Hoffmeier again. He goes, no Egyptologists would ever read the signs of a foreign ethnic entity as indicating a foreign land, but rather a people group. And this points towards a nomadic ethnic group, possibly still wandering or unlanded. The Merneptah stele records the victories of Merneptah over the Libyans, as I briefly mentioned earlier, mainly, but does not mention Israel, as Nate states, as conquering them, is what I mean by that. So this discrepancy, however, lies with the determinatives, which seemingly indicate that they had not yet settled in the Levant. Ergo, this stele does not really support the early Exodus date. So,
must be incorrect. But if you know how to read Egyptian hieroglyphics, you'll know that's not what it's actually talking about. Because the literal signs that go on behind that are not necessarily meaning the seed of mankind, but literally the signs are the seed and the storehouses, basically, of seed grain are no more.
Oh,
we see the house of grain is no more. So literally what it's saying is Israel is laid waste and its storehouses, its grain is no more. In other words, it's exactly what a conquering army does. It goes through, it lays waste to the land, but it takes all the food and supplies with them. Mm-hmm. And so it's basically Merneptah saying, I have, taken away their food and I've taken it and fed my army. So it's not necessarily that Israel was wiped from the face of the earth and wiped off the map. It's literally, the literal signs are its house of bread grain is no more. And so that's basically a reference to the storehouses of grain. Anyhow, it's fascinating. And the fascinating thing about this...
More fascinating.
Not only does it depict or mention the first ever recorded mention of Israel, but the way that it depicts them is fascinating. It depicts them as a people group, which is different than the other
That's
groups like
telling,
Canaan and Ashkelon
actually.
on there. They're actually depicted with a symbol that means a foreign land, or basically a city-state or a nation.
Let me go ahead and tell you why that's fascinating here, is that the Merneptah Stele, as he even says, dates to 1208 BCE. And if the conquest should have already happened by the early Exodus standards, it should have already been a landed people. They were a landed people in the pre-monarchic period. If you get to 1st and 2nd Samuel, they're landed. They have a king already, Saul. So Saul is already royalty, or he's royalty. He's landed. He has a king. He has a kingdom. And then he tries to pass that on to Ishbosheth, or Ishbaal. And then there was a revolt. David overthrows him, and then the Davidic throne is established after that. And then David moves the capital from Heshbon to Jerusalem. So Israel's already landed, should be landed by the early Exodus proponent by this time, according to the early Exodus proponents. So it's interesting how he kind of leaves that out here.
So these other groups, the Canaanites and Ashkelon, they're depicted as people groups, known established people groups with a kingdom and a king and a established land. When it comes to Israel,
before he goes on here, that's what I'm trying to say, is that if you have a king, you're not going to be a wandering people group. You should be landed and established where you are. So you wouldn't have that foreign people group determinative there at the end of Israel. You would have that nation mountain determinative.
They don't show them as an established people group with a kingdom and an establishment. They show them as a collective of people. Now, again, this takes place around 1208 BC. This would take place during the time of the judges. And so fascinatingly enough, the very mention of them being a collective people group matches exactly with the condition of the Israelites at this.
I know he just said time of the judges, but I think he's just like conflating times here and time, like lengths of time. That's why I kind of mentioned the pre-monarch. It says pre-monarchic, but they were landed by the time you get to Saul. So by their standard, I would think that by the early Exodus proponents that they would, you get to Saul about this time if you want to go by dates, I would say. So there are a couple of things here. It would seem that Nate is definitely going to take the years in the book of Judges literally. He hasn't actually said it, but I have a feeling I'm going to operate under a presupposition here that he's going to take the years in the book of Judges literally, which really doesn't add up since the years do not match up. In his commentary on the book of Judges, Dr. Richard Hess is careful to note that the problem is obvious. If you add up all the years, if you want to take all the years literally, it adds up to 591, which far exceeds the 480 or the 440 even cited in 1 Kings 6:1 by more than a century, meaning that we cannot and should not take those numbers literally. Furthermore, this figure contradicts the figure, that is the 591 contradicts the 480 or 440 figure found in 1 Kings 6:1 as well. Now, one could possibly resolve this, Hess goes on here, one could possibly resolve this problem with overlapping. However, Hess again cautions that the use of the number 480 raises the question whether this entire scheme is perhaps artificially constructed. The figure, representing 12 generations of 40 years, seems to reflect a theology of history more than a precise chronology of historical events. The inconsistencies with which the author uses numbers may suggest that we should not try to force the calculations into a coherent scheme. And Hess concludes that this literary structure is reinforced by the number of judges over Israel is exactly 12, which matches the tribes. Now, maybe I need water. Now, I will admit, though, if I'm wrong on how he takes judges, or if I'm wrong on the chronological inconsistency that I think is here, I will admit here that this stele seemingly fits both the late and early date Exodus accounts, since there is no monarchy. But if Nate takes the numbers in Judges literally, his argument will seemingly fall apart. So,
this point in Scripture. They're not depicted as a kingdom with a king because during the time of the judges, Israel had no king, right?
Not yet, anyway.
So again, this confirms, we like to say, this confirms the pre-monarchy status of Israel during the time of the judges. So again, this is confirmation from archaeology of what was taking place over in Israel at this time. The Israelites are there, but they're not a kingdom with a king. They're a collective people group, different tribes with their different lands. And so that's what we see here. They're a foreign people group. And so it's fascinating. The earliest mention also is exactly what we see in Scripture.
Is there any mention of in Judges of the Israelites attacking or fighting with the Egyptians?
There's not, no. And so we've looked at that, trying to figure out when that would have taken place.
Which I would assume is again problematic for the early date Exodus proponents if Egypt isn't mentioned in Judges, but is mentioned in their monoletters, and you're conflating their monoletters and all this stuff. You would assume that the Egyptians would be there and there would be a defeat. Oh, the Egyptians were there. We encountered them. We were defeated by them, blah, blah, blah. Because of all the other people groups in the area, the Canaanites in the area, with from Hatzor all the way down to Jericho and Jerusalem. So, yeah, it's a bit problematic there as well.
And so there's timelines when we kind of think it would have taken place, but this timeline of the judges, hundreds of years we're talking about. Yeah. And so there's only a few things that are actually mentioned during those hundreds of years.
Yeah, it seems like he's taking that number literally, which again, how do you not understand that those numbers don't add up and they don't match 1 Kings 6:1?
Yeah.
This is not necessarily one that we see in Scripture, although the conditions of what take place in there, there are lots of smaller battles and things going on that could have taken place. It's not mentioned in Scripture. I wish it were, but it's not. Yeah. But the fact that Israel's mentioned in the right way as a people group, I think that's exciting.
It is exciting. Good.
And one last thing here before I close out with this video is that it mentions the Philistines, which were a sea people, and the Israelites had reached all the way down. Now, I might be all the way down, because the Philistines, if I'm not mistaken, are mentioned in Judges, along with these other people groups. I like the overlapping part that Hess mentions in his commentary on Judges. It has weight, I think. If you are in pockets like where the Israelites are. So I think that's certainly a better explanation than what Nate gives here and what ABR as a whole gives. So with that in mind, guys, I think I'm going to stop it here. That's really all I have for you guys on this video. He'll go more into the seal of Jacob and how that's possibly a connection. She actually goes so far to say there's possibly a connection to actual Jacob in Genesis. I think in Genesis. So we're just going to go ahead and stop it for here right now. If you guys again like this video, please give it a like, and if you aren't subscribed, please subscribe. And again, I'll list all my sources in the description below after I get off here, and a link to my Patreon if you're interested. So I want to thank you guys for coming. Do you guys have any questions at all? I do want to see if you guys have questions. Maybe I got to answer a couple of questions before I go. I forgot that. Otherwise, if not, I can just go ahead and end it. All right. I should have said that earlier, but well. All right, guys. Well, I'll go ahead and end it now, and I will continue another live stream next Wednesday. Topic to be determined. So I want to thank you guys for coming, and have a great evening.